What would you do if the walls of your workplace suddenly turned into a battlefield? One quiet afternoon, four furious men stormed into the glass tower of Harrington Global, their anger echoing off the marble halls. Everyone ran, everyone except one woman, Emily Carter, the secretary no one ever noticed, stepped forward. Her voice didn't just cut through the chaos, it changed the course of her life forever. You'll have to go through me first. From that single moment, nothing would ever be the same. A billionaire CEO, James Harrington, found himself not only under attack by enemies outside the company, but by shadows within. Lies, sabotage, forged contracts, even fire threatened to destroy everything he had built. And through it all, Emily, ordinary, steady, quietly resilient, stood in the storm. But courage comes at a cost. With whispers turning into scandal and allies revealing themselves as traitors. The question grew sharper: was Emily just a pawn in a ruthless game? Or was she the key to saving it all? And maybe, just maybe, love was waiting in the ashes. Before we begin this journey of betrayal, loyalty, and courage, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's step into the story. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall glass windows of Harrington Global Tower, staining the polished marble floors with streaks of gold. Outside, Denver's skyline shimmered with late daylight, the mountains standing still in the distance, steady as guardians. Inside, however, the air was anything but steady. It began with the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the executive hallway. At first, no one paid much attention. In a building of 30 floors, footsteps were constant assistants rushing, phones ringing, printers whirring. But these steps were heavier, louder, carrying a rhythm of anger that made people pause. Then the glass doors to the CEO's wing slammed open with a crack that rattled picture frames on the wall. 4 men burst in. Their voices thundered, fists clenched, faces red with rage. James Harrington. One of them shouted, his words vibrating against the marble. "You ruined us. Now we ruin you." The receptionist screamed, chairs scraped back, a stack of files spilled onto the floor, papers fluttering like startled birds. Secretaries darted for safety, heels clattering against tile. In seconds, the once calm corridor became chaos. And at the far end of the hall, James Harrington himself emerged from the boardroom. He was still in his navy suit, his tie pulled neatly against his collar. For a man known throughout Denver as unshakable, a billionaire who had built Harrington Global from a single office to an empire, he suddenly looked human. His green eyes widened, and his hand froze on the doorframe. For a heartbeat. The most powerful man in the tower seemed vulnerable. It was in that heartbeat Emily Carter made her choice. She had been standing by her desk, only 20 feet away, watching as panic rippled through the floor. Everyone else ran. She did not. Her pulse pounded against her ribs. Her knees threatened to buckle, but something inside her held still. Emily wasn't tall, nor did she carry authority in her appearance. She was 28, with calm blue eyes and chestnut brown hair pinned into a simple twist. That day she wore a cream blouse tucked into a charcoal pencil skirt. Clothes chosen not for glamour, but for neatness. She had no armor, just resolve. While the others scrambled, Emily stepped forward. The men's shouting filled the air, sharp and violent, but she walked straight into it. Her shoes clicked against marble, steady, deliberate. She moved until she stood between them and James Harrington. Her voice was soft at first, nearly swallowed by the noise, but then it rose, firm and trembling all at once. "You'll have to go through me first." Silence. The words sliced the chaos like a blade. Even the furious men froze, taken aback by the sight of a secretary slight, ordinary, utterly unarmed standing in their way. James blinked, disbelief etched across his face. For years he had commanded boardrooms, silenced rivals, negotiated billion-dollar deals. Yet nothing stunned him quite like his secretary, standing tall with fire in her eyes. Emily's chest rose and fell with quick breaths. Fear burned in her veins, but she didn't flinch. She held her arms slightly out, not as a fighter, but as a barrier. "You're angry," she said, her voice steadier now. "I hear it, but hurting him won't give you justice. It won't fix what you've lost." The tallest man snarled, his knuckles white. For a moment, it looked as though he might shove her aside, but something in her gaze stopped him. The fury in his eyes clashed with confusion, with hesitation. Behind her, James Harrington found his voice. "Emily," he began. But the words faltered. He had commanded thousands. But in that moment, he could only watch. Security finally thundered into the hall, drawn by the commotion. Uniformed guards surged forward, forcing the intruders back with sharp commands. Within minutes, the four men were restrained, their voices still echoing about pensions, broken promises, and shattered futures. The danger had passed, but Emily remained where she was, her back still to James, her body still a shield even though the threat was gone. 10 minutes later, the corridor was eerily quiet again. Papers had been gathered, chairs set upright, but the air felt scorched, as though the anger still lingered in the walls. Staff whispered from a distance, eyes darting toward Emily and James. Emily stood near the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her heart still raced, though her face appeared calm. She hadn't run, hadn't faltered, but inside, she knew what she had risked. Behind her, James's voice came low, almost uncertain. "I didn't ask you to do that." She turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "I know. You could have been hurt. So could you." Their gazes locked, blue against green, neither willing to look away. For a moment, the roles of CEO and secretary vanished, leaving only a man and a woman standing in the aftermath of chaos, trying to make sense of what had just happened. James reached into his suit pocket. His hand emerged holding something small, a silver fountain pen, polished and heavy. "You borrowed this weeks ago," he said quietly. "I thought you might want it back." Emily blinked, startled. She had borrowed the pen during a meeting, never expecting him to notice. Yet here it was, remembered, offered. She accepted it slowly, the cool metal pressing into her palm, heavier than it should have been. "Thank you," she whispered. James's voice softened. "No, thank you." From that moment forward, nothing between them would ever be the same. The building still smelled faintly of smoke and adrenaline, though the four intruders had been escorted away. Their shouts echoed in everyone's memory. By the time the last uniformed guard disappeared down the hall, the executive floor of Harrington Global felt like a church after a storm, silent, uneasy, filled with whispers no one dared to voice too loudly. Most of the staff had scattered to lower levels, taking refuge in the safety of numbers. Only a handful lingered, whispering near the elevators, their eyes darting toward the corner office where James Harrington stood, his hands still in his pockets, his posture unusually rigid. Emily Carter remained by the tall window, her reflection outlined against the Denver skyline. Outside, the traffic moved as if nothing had happened, cars sliding along the wide boulevards, the hum of normal life continuing undisturbed. Inside, however, her body still carried the tremors of fear. She folded her arms tight across her chest, as though holding herself together. James's footsteps broke the silence, slow, deliberate, each step heavy against the polished floor. He stopped just behind her, the air between them charged. For years, Emily had worked no more than 10 feet from his desk, yet he had rarely looked at her for longer than a few seconds at a time. Instructions, brief nods, an occasional thank you, that was the extent of their exchanges. But now, he found himself studying her as though he had never truly seen her before. She looked ordinary at first glance. A secretary in a modest blouse, hair pinned neatly back, flats chosen for practicality rather than style. Yet James noticed the steadiness in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled only when she thought no one was watching. He saw the courage it had taken to stand there, between him and 4 furious men, when every instinct must have screamed at her to run. And he wondered why James cleared his throat, but his voice sounded strangely softer than he intended. "You should have left with the others." Emily turned from the window, her blue eyes calm but not cold. Would that have helped you? The simplicity of the question unsettled him. He had faced senators, investors, and rivals across polished boardroom tables, yet this quiet young woman had managed to strip him of his practiced defenses. No, he admitted after a pause, but it would have kept you safe. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Safety isn't always the most important thing. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, not the kind filled with tension, but the kind that demanded reflection. James felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, a man who carried the burdens of an empire without faltering. Yet today, his composure had cracked, and in that crack, Emily Carter had stepped forward not for her own sake, but for his. As the evening deepened, the floor emptied further. Assistants packed their bags in hushed silence. Lights dimmed across the open office space. The chaos of earlier now seemed distant, yet its shadow lingered in every corner. James remained in his office longer than usual, unable to shake the image of Emily standing there, her voice trembling, but her gaze unyielding. Later that night, when the tower finally fell quiet, Emily slipped out into the cool Denver air. She drove her old sedan through the familiar streets, past the glowing shop signs and late-night diners, until she reached her apartment on the east side of the city. It wasn't much a small two-bedroom on the fourth floor of a brick building that had stood for decades. The carpet in the hallway was worn. The stairwell smelled faintly of coffee and old paint. But to Emily, it was home. She kicked off her shoes the moment she stepped inside, setting her bag down on the small kitchen table. A stack of unopened mail waited beside a bowl of apples. On the counter sat a mug she hadn't washed from that morning, ringed faintly with coffee. Emily lived alone, but not unhappily. She valued the quiet, the freedom to read by lamplight without interruption, to water her plants on the windowsill, to fall asleep without the weight of anyone else's expectations. Yet that night, the apartment felt unusually silent. She replayed the scene in her mind again and again, the shouts, the trembling in her own knees, the way James's eyes had widened when she stepped forward. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. "Why did I do that?" she whispered to the glass. It wasn't logic. It wasn't bravery in the way movies portrayed it. It had been instinct, a refusal to let violence define the moment. Across town, in his penthouse, James Harrington sat with a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. The city stretched below, glittering, alive. Yet all he could think about was the secretary who had faced danger for him. James was not a man easily rattled. He had built Harrington Global with precision, with control, with rules that left no room for weakness. But tonight, he felt a disquiet he could not shake. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the silver fountain pen resting on his desk. "Why her?" he murmured aloud. Why would someone like Emily Carter, a woman with no stake in boardroom wars, no wealth, no shield, risk herself for him? Was it loyalty duty, or something deeper he couldn't name? The weight of that question pressed on him long into the night. By morning, the headlines had already spread. CEO confronted in office attack. Secretary stands between billionaire and threat. The story carried across social media, fractured into admiration, suspicion, and ridicule. But inside Harrington Global, the silence was louder than the news. Staff looked at Emily differently now, some with respect, some with skepticism, some with envy. And James Harrington, for the first time in years, walked into his office carrying more than spreadsheets and contracts. He carried the echo of a single, haunting question: who exactly was Emily Carter? The following day unfolded with an uneasy rhythm at Harrington Global. The usual buzz of keyboards and phones carried a sharper edge. Conversations clipped into whispers whenever Emily Carter passed by. She felt the weight of eyes on her back, though no one spoke openly. Some offered faint smiles, others simply looked away. Emily focused on her tasks, her hands steady on the keyboard, even when her mind wandered back to the previous afternoon. The memory of 4 angry men, the chaos in the hall, and the strange quiet that followed still clung to her like smoke. James Harrington, meanwhile, spent most of the day in closed meetings. Yet every time he passed through the corridor, his gaze lingered briefly on Emily's desk. He caught himself staring more than once, unsettled by a question he could not silence. What kind of person does something like that without hesitation? By early evening, the offices began to empty. Assistants gathered their coats. The cleaning staff rolled their carts down the hall. Emily remained at her desk, sorting through reports, determined to stay invisible. She was startled when James's low voice broke the silence. "Emily," he said from the doorway, his tone unusually tentative. She looked up, blinking. "Yes." "Mr. Harrington." He stepped closer, one hand still resting in his pocket. "I owe you dinner." Emily froze, uncertain she'd heard him correctly. "Dinner." "As a thank you," he clarified. His voice was calm, yet there was a softness in his eyes she had not seen before. For a moment, she considered refusing. A CEO inviting his secretary out could only spark more whispers. But something in his gaze was disarming, stripped of the usual distance. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "All right," but somewhere simple. An hour later, they found themselves walking down a quiet Denver street, the city lights glowing against the cool air. James's black sedan had been left behind, replaced by an easy walk that neither of them commented on. They stopped at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. Its sign was modest, its windows strung with warm golden lights. Inside, the scent of thyme, garlic, and simmering broth wrapped around them like a blanket. The waitress, recognizing James but wisely saying nothing, led them to a small table by the window. No white tablecloths, no polished silverware, just sturdy bowls, baskets of bread, and the hum of ordinary life. James loosened his tie, something Emily had rarely seen him do, and sat across from her. Their bowls of chicken soup arrived, steaming, with bread still warm from the oven. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. The soup was rich and comforting, the bread crusty and soft inside. Emily broke hers slowly, dipping it into the broth, savoring the simplicity. She realized with surprise that this was the first time she had seen James in a setting that wasn't polished marble or glass. At last, he spoke, his voice low. "I used to be better at this." Emily looked up. "At what?" "Listening," he admitted. He stirred his soup absently, his green eyes focused on the steam. "When Harrington Global was smaller, I knew every employee by name. I remembered birthdays. I asked about families. Somewhere along the line, I stopped hearing people. I managed numbers instead." Emily studied him, her expression thoughtful. "That happens when power grows too big," she said gently. "Sometimes power blinds you more than it protects you." James looked at her, the words sinking deeper than he expected. For a moment, he had no reply. Emily tore another piece of bread, her hands steady. "Those men yesterday, they weren't just angry, they were broken. And you," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "you look surprised by their pain." He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his shoulders heavy. "Maybe I was. Maybe I forgot what it feels like to stand in their place." The honesty startled her. For all his wealth and reputation, James Harrington was sitting across from her now, not as a CEO, but as a man acknowledging his flaws. Outside, a violinist played faintly down the block, the tune drifting through the open window. The candle on their table flickered in the breeze, casting their faces in soft light. Emily sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what to make of this version of him, less armor, more human. It unsettled her, yet also stirred something she couldn't name. They spoke little after that, but the silence between them was different than the one in the office. It wasn't heavy, it was honest. When they finally rose to leave, James held the door open for her. The cool night wrapped around them, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon. As they walked back, James glanced at her. "Thank you." "Emily." She looked up at him, surprised. "For what?" for reminding me that silence doesn't mean strength. Sometimes it just means I've stopped listening." Emily didn't reply, but her heart beat faster as they returned to the tower. That night, back in her modest apartment, Emily set her bag down and sat quietly at the table. She thought of the soup, the bread, the unexpected honesty in James's voice. She wasn't sure what path she had stepped onto, but she knew the world she had known at Harrington Global had shifted. And it had all started with a dinner that wasn't planned. It started with a shaky clip on someone's phone, a video barely 2 minutes long, grainy and unsteady, but powerful enough to set the internet ablaze. It showed Emily Carter standing in the executive hallway of Harrington Global, her voice trembling but clear as she faced 4 furious men. The words carried through the poor audio with surprising sharpness. "You'll have to go through me first." The clip spread overnight. By morning, it was everywhere: news sites, talk shows, social media feeds. Millions of people watched. Some replayed the moment again and again, captivated by the secretary's bravery. Others mocked it, suggesting it was staged. A few doubted her intentions entirely. "Who even is she?" One headline read. "Secretary or savior?" asked another. Underneath, comment sections churned admiration, sarcasm, suspicion. At first, Emily tried to ignore it. She kept her head down as she walked through the glass doors of Harrington Global the next morning, but the weight of attention followed her like a shadow. Whispers trailed her in the lobby. 2 interns near the coffee machine fell silent as she passed, then erupted into hushed chatter once she was gone. In the elevator, she felt eyes on her, scanning, measuring, deciding what kind of woman she was. By the time she reached her desk, her pulse was already racing. The small space she once found comfort in now felt like a stage. Every movement answering phones, typing reports, flipping through files was performed under invisible scrutiny. James Harrington stepped out of his office mid-morning, flanked by 2 board members. Normally, his presence would draw every eye, but today, it was Emily who carried the spotlight. Staff glanced from him to her, as though searching for meaning in the way their gazes brushed in passing. James's expression remained unreadable, controlled as ever, but when his green eyes lingered on Emily, just for a second, she felt heat rush to her cheeks. She quickly lowered her gaze, pretending to study her notepad. The day dragged on, heavy with tension. In the staff lounge, Emily overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear. "She's braver than he is." Or maybe she just wanted attention. "Did you see how close they were standing?" The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She poured herself a cup of coffee, hands trembling slightly. The bitter scent rose, grounding her, but not enough to steady the turmoil inside. By afternoon, her phone buzzed with messages from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Some sent congratulations, others warnings. One wrote, "Careful, Emily. The higher they lift you, the harder they drop you." She shut the phone off and slipped it into her bag. As the sun dipped behind the Rockies, the office thinned out, but Emily stayed. She lingered at her desk, typing slowly, unwilling to face the empty quiet of her apartment. Yet, even in the near-empty floor, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Her thoughts swirled with doubt. Had she done the right thing? Wouldn't it have been wiser to run like everyone else? She imagined alternate versions of herself slipping away, disappearing into the crowd, forgotten by now. Instead, she had stayed. She had stood. And now her name was on strangers' tongues. She rested her forehead against her hand, her breath shaky. In the silence, questions gnawed at her. Was courage still courage when it brought only trouble? Had she risked too much for a man who barely knew her? Or had she done the only thing she could live with, no matter the cost? The clock ticked softly, filling the space her doubts left behind. From his office, James Harrington watched her through the glass wall. He saw the weariness in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight too large. Something inside him tightened, a mix of guilt and admiration. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, not because of markets or mergers, but because he couldn't shield her from whispers. Emily finally gathered her things and stepped out into the cool Denver night. The city lights flickered like restless stars. She walked to her car, her reflection faint in the glass of the tower behind her. The storm outside had passed, but inside her, another storm brewed, one made not of shouts and fists, but of voices, eyes, and doubt. The boardroom at Harrington Global had always carried an air of command. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, leather chairs lined in symmetry, and panoramic windows revealed the Denver skyline in shades of late afternoon. It was a room designed for power, for decisions worth millions, even billions. But today, power felt brittle. Emily Carter sat near the end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't wanted to be here. She was a secretary, not an executive, yet James Harrington had asked her to attend. She suspected why the moment the meeting began. Richard Hale, one of the oldest board members, leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light. His voice was sharp, his words cutting. This circus must end. James, he declared, the video of your secretary standing in front of you has made the company look weak. You look weak. And weakness, as you know, weakens the company. Murmurs rippled around the table. A few directors nodded, others shifted uneasily. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. She lowered her gaze, wishing for invisibility. The title secretary was supposed to mean schedules and minutes, not scandal. James's expression remained controlled, but his jaw tightened. What happened in that hallway was not weakness, he said evenly. It was courage. Richard scoffed. Courage. It was recklessness. What message does it send when the CEO of Harrington Global hides behind an assistant? The word struck Emily like a slap. She clenched her hands together under the table, fingernails pressing into her palms. Her heart hammered. Every instinct told her to stay silent, to endure. After all, this was not her world. She was out of place here, a guest in a room that did not belong to her. Yet another voice rose inside her, steady and insistent. If you remain silent, you agree with them. She inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. Then, before doubt could pull her back, she lifted her chin. With respect, "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice clear though soft. "I didn't stand there to make Mr. Harrington look weak. I stood there because someone had to, and no one else did." The room fell quiet. Chairs shifted. A few eyebrows lifted in surprise. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Naive!" he snapped. That's what it was. Naive and dangerous. Emily felt her pulse race, but she did not lower her gaze. "If choosing dignity over violence is naive," she said, her voice gaining strength, "then I'll accept the word proudly." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. For the first time, Emily felt the weight of every eye in the room, not just judging, but measuring. Richard's nostrils flared, ready to retort. But before he could, James Harrington's voice cut across the table. "Enough," he said, his tone firm, low, commanding. The room stilled. James leaned forward, his green eyes sweeping the table. She made a choice, a courageous one. What threatens this company is not her courage. What threatens us is fear. Fear in this room, fear in the halls, and the whispers that breed because of it. His words landed with authority. Even Richard Hale hesitated. Though his scowl remained, Emily sat motionless, her breath shallow. She hadn't expected James to defend her, not like this, for a man who rarely revealed more than measured sentences. His words carried the weight of conviction. For a moment, their eyes met across the table. His gaze softened, just slightly, and she felt the unspoken truth in it. "You are not alone." The meeting pressed on, but the tone had shifted. Directors spoke of damage control, of investors, of stabilizing markets. Yet, beneath the business language, something new lingered, an acknowledgement that a secretary had spoken in a room of power and had not been silenced. By the time the meeting adjourned, dusk had settled across the skyline. The lights of Denver twinkled against the darkening sky. Emily gathered her notepad with trembling hands, her pulse still racing. As the directors filed out, Richard cast her a final look, disdain mixed with something sharper. Warning, perhaps. She swallowed hard, refusing to let her hands shake. When the room finally emptied, only James remained. He stood by the window, tie loosened, his reflection merging with the city lights beyond. Emily lingered at the door, uncertain whether to leave. "You didn't have to speak," James said without turning. His voice was low, thoughtful. "No," she answered softly. "But silence can be heavier than words." He turned then, his gaze steady on hers. And sometimes, silence is mistaken for consent. For a long moment, they stood in the dim room, the city glowing behind them. Neither moved, neither spoke further. But the air carried a shift, quiet yet undeniable. Emily stepped out into the hallway, her steps slow, her mind racing. She had spoken when she wasn't supposed to. She had stood her ground in a room designed to silence her, and James Harrington had stood with her. The boardroom storm had passed, but its ripples carried through the halls of Harrington Global. Staff spoke in careful tones. Investors sent cautious emails. And the once unshakable reputation of James Harrington now felt fragile. In the middle of this shifting landscape, a new figure arrived. Daniel Cross stepped into the tower like he owned it, tall, impeccably dressed in a navy coat that brushed his knees. His stride carried the confidence of someone accustomed to winning rooms before he even spoke. His dark hair was combed back with precision, his smile charming, yet edged with something sharper. At 36, Daniel was the kind of man newspapers loved to profile: self-made investor, magnetic speaker, and rumored to have turned struggling companies into gold. He was also a man James Harrington knew well, too well. When Emily Carter first saw him, it was in the staff lounge late one evening. She had stayed behind to finish filing notes from the board meeting. The room was nearly empty, just the hum of a vending machine and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. She bent over the copier, collecting pages, when a voice behind her made her start. "You're the heroine now," the voice drawled smoothly. "Why hide in the shadows?" Emily turned sharply, clutching the stack of papers. Daniel Cross leaned casually against the doorframe, his smile warm, but his eyes calculating. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone cautious. He stepped inside, the soles of his polished shoes silent on the tile. "Don't be modest. The whole city knows who you are. The secretary who shielded the billionaire. Braver than the CEO himself, some say." Emily stiffened. She had grown weary of that phrase, tossed around like a coin. "I didn't do it for attention," she said firmly. "Of course not," Daniel said easily, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "But attention rarely asks our permission before it arrives." "Does it?" Something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't mocking, it was worse. It was amusement, as though he saw the storm she had stepped into as nothing more than an entertaining game. "I'm Daniel Cross," he added, extending a hand. "Investor. And perhaps," his smile deepened, "your new ally." Emily hesitated before taking his hand. His grip was firm, controlled, lingering a second longer than necessary. She withdrew quickly, folding her arms across her chest. "I don't need allies," she said softly. "Everyone needs allies," Daniel replied, his voice like velvet wrapped around steel, "especially in this building." Before Emily could respond, the air shifted, the doorway filled with another presence. James Harrington. He stood rigid, his green eyes sharp, his jaw set. His gaze flicked from Emily to Daniel, then back again. The tension between the two men was immediate, electric, as though their history was written in unsaid words. "Daniel," James said flatly. "James," Daniel replied, his smile never faltering. "It's been too long." The room felt suddenly smaller. Emily sensed the weight of something unspoken pressing between them. Rivalry, unfinished business, old grudges simmering beneath polite tones. James stepped inside, his presence filling the space like a shield. "What are you doing here just meeting your remarkable secretary?" Daniel said lightly. "Though I must admit, she's more than I expected. Public perception is everything these days. And right now," his gaze lingered on Emily. "She might be the only one people trust." James's jaw tightened. "She's not a tool for your games," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Games? No. James. Strategy. There's a difference." Emily felt the air stiffen, like storms colliding. She glanced between them, realizing she was standing in the middle of something larger than boardroom politics. Something personal. The silence stretched until Daniel finally tipped his head, as if conceding the moment. "Well," he said smoothly, "I should let you get back to your work. Miss Carter, it was a pleasure." He gave her a parting smile, then brushed past James on his way out. The faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. James remained still, his hands clenched at his sides. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. When James finally turned to her, his voice was quiet but edged. "Be careful around him." Emily swallowed. "Why?" "Because Daniel Cross doesn't walk into rooms without an agenda," James said, his gaze steady. "And when he looks at you, Emily, I don't trust what he sees." Emily held his eyes, her chest tightening. For the first time, she sensed that her act of courage had not just drawn whispers, it had drawn the attention of men whose battles reached far beyond her, and now she was caught between them. The message came late in the evening, just as Emily Carter was shutting down her computer. The office floor had already emptied. The hum of printers had gone silent. The glow of monitors dimmed. Only the faint buzz of fluorescent lights remained. Her phone buzzed on the desk. One new message from an unknown number: "Be careful who you trust. Next move is yours." Emily stared at the words until they blurred. A shiver crawled up her spine. She looked around the empty office, half expecting to see someone watching, but the glass walls reflected only her own pale face. Her hands tightened around the phone. She told herself it was just a prank, some cruel joke from someone who had seen the viral video. But the certainty never came. The message was too precise, too personal. She slipped the phone into her bag and left the building. The underground garage was quiet, too quiet. The concrete walls held the echo of her heels as she walked toward her car. Every sound magnified the distant hum of a ventilation fan, the faint drip of water somewhere in the shadows. She pressed her key fob, and her headlights blinked in the distance. Relief flickered through her chest, but it was short-lived. Behind her, footsteps, not hurried, not stumbling, deliberate. Emily froze. The air felt thick, her breath shallow. She turned her head slightly, but the rows of parked cars revealed only darkness. She quickened her pace, her bag clutched tight against her side. The footsteps followed. Her pulse pounded. She reached her car, fumbling with the handle, and slid inside. The lock clicked down the moment she shut the door. She gripped the steering wheel, her hands shaking. Through the windshield, the garage stretched in eerie stillness. Whoever had been there was gone or hiding. She didn't know which was worse. Emily started the engine, the sound breaking the silence. She pulled out quickly, headlights cutting through the shadows, her heart thundering until she emerged onto the street. Only then did she let out a breath, though it trembled. Back at her apartment, the unease lingered. She closed every lock, pulled the curtains tight, checked each room twice, yet the feeling of being watched clung to her skin. She sank into the couch, phone still in her hand, staring at the message again. "Be careful who you trust." Who could have sent it Daniel Cross? With his calculated charm, Richard Hale? With his simmering disdain, someone from the inside? Someone she passed every day in the hallway? Or was it a stranger entirely, hiding behind the faceless anonymity of a phone? Her chest tightened. The thought that gnawed at her wasn't just who sent it, but what they wanted. She pulled the silver pen from her bag, turning it over in her hand. Its weight steadied her. The dent along its side, familiar beneath her thumb. James had given it back to her with quiet intention. To him, it was a legacy. to her, now. It was an anchor. Emily whispered to herself, her voice low. I won't run, because deep down, she knew that if she fled now, she would never stop running. Fear would own her, and that was something she could not allow. The next morning, she walked through the lobby of Harrington Global with her chin high, though her stomach twisted with nerves. She felt the eyes again, whispers following her steps. Some called her brave, others reckless. She heard it all in fragments. That's the one, CEO's shield, or maybe his liability. The whispers pressed against her, but she didn't falter. In the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her hair pinned neatly, her blouse buttoned just so, her expression calm, but her eyes betrayed the truth, an edge of exhaustion, a shadow of fear. Inside, she carried the echo of that message, next move is yours. What move? What game had she been pulled into without consent? Later that night, leaving the office again, she lingered at her desk longer than usual. The idea of stepping back into that garage made her chest tighten. When she finally did, she walked faster, her senses sharp, her bag gripped tightly. No footsteps this time, no shadows shifting. Yet the silence felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. In her car, she sat for a moment before turning the key. Her breath fogged the window in the cool night air. She whispered to herself again, steadying her nerves. I'm not running. But as she drove into the darkness, she couldn't shake the truth. Courage and fear often walk side by side. And tonight, both were in the car with her. The building had emptied long before. The clatter of keyboards, the ring of phones, the shuffle of footsteps all had faded into silence. Only the soft hum of the city seeped through the tall windows of James Harrington's office. Emily Carter was still at her desk, the glow of her monitor reflecting faintly against her glasses. She had told herself she would finish just one more report before heading home. But, truthfully, the quiet steadied her. In the silence, no one whispered about her, no one watched. The soft creak of a door startled her. She looked up. James stood there, tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm. In his hands were 2 paper cups, steam curling from their lids. He set one on her desk without a word. Emily blinked. Coffee. His lips curved faintly. You looked like you might collapse. I thought it might help. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Thank you. They sat across from each other, the office bathed in muted light. The shadows from the city stretched long, broken only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. Neither spoke much at first. James leaned back, sipping his coffee slowly, his eyes unreadable. Emily cradled hers, the bitter scent rising to meet her. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was different, full, steady, almost human. At last, James broke it. His voice was low, almost hesitant. Do you ever regret it? Standing there that day, Emily lifted her gaze. His green eyes met hers, steady but vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. No, she said softly. I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't. His jaw tightened, then eased. Neither could I. The words hung between them, unspoken truths circling like faint ripples. Emily sipped her coffee to steady herself, but her heart beat faster. For a long time, they simply sat 2 people who lived in different worlds, sharing the same quiet. Outside, the city pulsed with neon lights and rushing cars, but inside the office, time seemed to still. When Emily finally rose to leave, James stood too. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, but he only nodded once. She returned it, clutching the empty coffee cup as though it were proof that the evening had been real. The next morning shattered the calm. Emily arrived at the building to find whispers louder than usual. Heads turned openly as she crossed the lobby. Phones lifted not discreetly, but brazenly. Confused, she hurried to the elevator. By the time she reached her desk, the truth was waiting on her screen. An email had circulated across the company, spreading faster than wildfire. Attached was a photo. Her breath caught. It was her and James, sitting together in the lounge the night before, 2 paper cups between them, the light soft, their faces turned just slightly toward each other. The angle was sharp, deliberate. Someone had been there. Someone had watched. The caption beneath the photo was cruel in its simplicity. "Who really runs Harrington Global?" Emily's stomach dropped. She scrolled down, reading comments laced with mockery and speculation. "Looks cozy for a boss and secretary. So that's why she's untouchable." Figures. The bravery was just a show. Her hands trembled against the mouse. She glanced around the office, catching the sideways looks, the smirks, the raised eyebrows. Her cheeks burned, though anger flared hotter than shame. When James emerged from his office, the chatter dimmed. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his fury. His gaze swept the room, and for one fleeting moment, it locked with Emily's. Her chest tightened. The silence of last night had said so much more than this scandal ever could. But now, the world had decided to give it its own voice, and it was merciless. The storm of the photo had barely begun to settle when a new blow landed. Emily Carter was at her desk mid-morning, sorting through a stack of documents, when James Harrington appeared in her doorway. He didn't knock, he didn't even greet her. His face was pale, his green eyes shadowed with something darker than anger. "Inside," he said quietly. Her pulse leapt. She followed him into his office, the door closing behind them with a thud that seemed louder than it should have. On his desk lay a folder, its edges sharp, its presence ominous. James opened it without a word and slid the top sheet toward her. Emily's breath caught. Her name stared back at her in black ink, neat and precise, a signature, her signature, at the bottom of a contract she had never seen. The document detailed a transaction funds redirected, approval granted. It was the kind of paperwork that could topple reputations, ruin careers, and it bore her name. Her knees nearly buckled. That's not mine," she whispered. "I know," James said, his voice low, clipped. She tore her gaze from the paper to look at him. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched on the edge of the desk. He wasn't doubting her. He was furious not at her, but at whoever had done this. Still, the sight of her forged signature left her shaking. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest tightening. "Why me?" James's eyes softened, just slightly. "Because you're close to me. If you fall, I fall." The words pierced her. Not comforting, not cruel, just the stark truth. Emily sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling in her lap. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who would do this? Daniel Cross with his calculated charm? Richard Hale with his open disdain? Or someone else entirely? Hidden in the shadows of Harrington Global, the thought twisted her stomach. "Am I just a pawn in their game?" she murmured. James leaned forward, his voice steady. "No, you are not a pawn. That's exactly what they want you to believe." But Emily, his gaze locked on hers, intense, unwavering. "I won't let them destroy you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. But the photo scandal still lingered in her mind, the whispers still sharp in the hallways. Now, this contract. Each attack felt closer, sharper, harder to defend. "What if they don't need to destroy me?" she whispered. "What if I destroy myself just by standing too close to you?" James's expression darkened, anger flickering like a storm behind his eyes. "Don't say that. This isn't your fault. They are manufacturing lies, and I'll prove it." Emily studied him, searching for certainty in his words. He looked tired, exhausted, but his voice carried conviction. He wasn't backing down. Silence filled the room, heavy but alive. Emily reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the paper, tracing the forged signature. It was perfect, precise, too precise. Whoever had done it knew her hand well enough to mimic it flawlessly. Her chest tightened again. Whoever had set this trap wasn't a stranger. They were close. She dropped her hand, pulling it back as though the paper burned her. James watched her carefully. I'll call in IT. We'll trace the digital origin. Every document leaves a footprint. We'll find it. But Emily couldn't shake the weight in her chest. A question pressed hard against her ribs. How many more traps lay ahead? She left his office with the folder heavy in her arms. Back at her desk, she slid it into her bag, as though hiding it could keep the whispers at bay. Her fingers brushed against the silver pen inside, the dent cool against her palm. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the contract spread before her under the dim light. The inked name stared back, mocking her. Her thoughts circled endlessly. Am I just a pawn, a face for their games, a shield for a man who barely knows me? She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her temples. No answer came, only the echo of James's voice. I won't let them destroy you. She wanted to believe it, but the shadows in her apartment felt heavier than ever, as though someone else was listening. The alarm wailed just after 9 in the evening. Emily Carter had stayed late again, buried in spreadsheets, when the shrill sound pierced the quiet floor. She froze, her pen slipping from her fingers. Within seconds, shouts echoed down the hallway, the pounding of hurried footsteps shaking the walls. Fire, get out! Someone yelled. Emily grabbed her bag and hurried into the corridor. Acrid smoke already curled through the air, stinging her eyes, burning her throat. Red emergency lights pulsed against the walls, turning the glass offices into eerie mirrors of panic. A security officer sprinted past her, shouting over the chaos. Server room. It's the server room. Her heart lurched. The server room was the backbone of Harrington Global, its local archives, its paper trails, its digital records. If it burned, so did the proof James had promised to recover. Without thinking, Emily ran toward the restricted corridor. The air grew thicker, hotter. Smoke pressed against her lungs, every breath a struggle. Through the haze, she saw it flames clawing at the reinforced glass. Orange tongues licking upward as sprinklers hissed weakly overhead. The fire roared as if alive, devouring shelves of paper files, blackening metal cabinets, reducing months' years of history into ash. Emily. She turned. James Harrington was there, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled. He pushed through the smoke, his expression fierce, eyes burning as brightly as the flames. He caught her arm, pulling her back from the heat. You can't be here, he shouted, but the files she began. His grip tightened. They want you in there. Don't give them what they want. Behind him, security staff rushed in with extinguishers, their shouts lost under the roar. Water sprayed against the glass, steam rising in choking waves. Emily stumbled, coughing, but something on the ground caught her eye. A sheet of paper, half burned, had slipped from the room through the draft. It fluttered across the tiles, edges blackened, words still visible. She dropped to her knees, snatching it before the flames claimed it completely. The paper was hot, singed, but legible enough. Her stomach twisted. Another contract, another forged document, and once again, her name at the bottom. Emily's hands shook as she held it up to James. Look, another one? His face hardened. He seized the page, scanning the damning words. For a moment, his control cracked, fury raw in his voice. This is sabotage. The words cut through the chaos. Not accident, not negligence, deliberate destruction. Emily's chest tightened. She looked past him, into the room where flames consumed row after row of cabinets. Every file lost was another weapon for their enemies, and every forged signature planted was another blade at her throat. Security finally forced them back, corralling staff toward the exits. Emily coughed into her sleeve, her eyes stinging with smoke. James kept close, his hand firm at her elbow, guiding her through the haze until they burst into the lobby. The air there was only marginally clearer. Dozens of employees huddled near the glass doors, eyes wide with fear, their clothes streaked with ash. Outside, sirens wailed as fire trucks pulled up to the curb. Red and blue lights flashed wildly against the marble floors. Emily leaned against the wall, her breath ragged. Around her, Whispers surged again. She caught fragments. Sabotage. Insurance cover-up. Wasn't it her name on those contracts? Her pulse pounded in her ears. She pressed the charred page against her chest as though hiding it could erase the truth. James stood before the crowd, his posture unyielding despite the smoke streaking his face. "Everyone out," he ordered the staff. "Go home. We'll regroup in the morning." But when his eyes found Emily, they softened, if only slightly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "This isn't just about me anymore. They're targeting you as much as they're targeting me. Maybe more." Emily swallowed hard, her throat raw from smoke. "Why me?" James's gaze lingered on her, the weight of his silence heavier than words. "Finally," he said, "because you matter." She froze, her breath caught in her chest. In the distance, firefighters shouted, hoses roared, water hissed against flames. But inside her, another fire burned fear. Yes, but also something deeper. Emily looked down at the charred contract in her hands. The ink blurred but still damning. The dent of the silver pen pressed against her palm through her bag, grounding her. Whoever was orchestrating this wanted her erased, broken, silenced, but standing in the ash-filled lobby, James Harrington's hand steady on her arm, Emily made a quiet vow she would not be burned into silence. Not now, not ever. The boardroom smelled faintly of smoke, even though the fire had been contained the night before. The marble floors gleamed as though scrubbed clean, but the air remained heavy, scorched by more than flames. Emily Carter sat near the far end of the long mahogany table, her palms pressed flat against her notepad. She hadn't wanted to be here again, not after the fire, not after the whispers. But James Harrington had insisted. Around her, the directors gathered, faces stern, voices clipped. The air buzzed with tension. Richard Hale wasted no time. His silver hair caught the morning light as he leaned forward, voice sharp enough to cut steel. "This has gone too far. James," he declared, "the fire, the forged contracts, the photographs, it all circles back to her." He thrust a finger toward Emily, as if she were already guilty. "The girl must go." Emily stiffened. Heat crept up her neck, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She fought to keep her expression calm, but her hands trembled beneath the table. Another director chimed in, voice clipped. "Investors are losing confidence. Our stock dropped 3 points overnight. Stability is at risk. We cannot afford scandal." Murmurs of agreement rippled across the room. Emily kept her gaze fixed on her notepad, afraid that if she looked up, she would see only condemnation staring back at her. But she felt it anyway, the weight of judgment, the prickle of eyes measuring her worth, deciding her fate. Richard's voice rose again, louder, harsher. "We cannot let sentiment cloud business. This company is bleeding, and the source of the wound is clear. Remove her, and the bleeding stops." The words hit like stones. Emily's chest tightened, her mind racing. Should she speak? Should she defend herself? Or would her voice only make things worse? Her throat tightened with unspoken words. She thought of the forged signature, the flames devouring the archives, the whispers in the hallways. Each blow had been designed to break her, and now they were succeeding. Silence pressed down, suffocating. Then another sound broke it. James Harrington's chair scraped back as he rose to his feet. His presence filled the room, his tall frame commanding attention. His green eyes swept across the table, steady and unflinching. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "You will not scapegoat her?" The room stilled. Richard scoffed. "James." But James cut him off, his tone sharp as a blade. "What threatens this company is not Emily Carter. It is the rot within these walls, the fear that has taken hold of you, the leaks and lies and sabotage eating us from the inside out. That is what endangers Harrington Global." The directors shifted uneasily. A few exchanged wary glances. James continued, his voice rising with conviction. Emily stood in front of violence when no one else did. She has faced humiliation, suspicion, and threats, and through it all, she has not run. That is not weakness, that is strength. And it is strength this company desperately needs. Emily's breath caught. She lifted her gaze, unable to stop herself. James was standing tall, his words carrying not just authority, but truth. Richard's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing. "You're blinded, James. You're letting personal attachment cloud your judgment." James leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. His voice dropped, calm but dangerous. "I am not blinded. I am clear-eyed, and I see more integrity in Emily Carter than I have seen in this board for years." Gasps rippled through the room. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She sat frozen, the words echoing through her chest. Richard sputtered, searching for a rebuttal, but for once, his sharp tongue failed him. He sank back into his chair, his glare burning but silent, and then, from the far end of the table, Daniel Cross shifted. He had been quiet the entire meeting, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, but now, he leaned back, folding his hands loosely. His dark eyes flicked to Emily, lingering just long enough to send a chill through her. There was no need for words. His silence was calculated, deliberate, more unsettling than Richard's fury. A smirk ghosted across his lips, brief and knowing, before he looked away. The meeting carried on, talk turning to damage control, investor calls, public statements. But the air had shifted. James's words lingered, hanging over every line of strategy. When it finally adjourned, Emily gathered her notepad with trembling hands. She rose slowly, her knees unsteady, her pulse still racing. As the directors filed out, Richard refused to meet her eyes. Daniel, however, offered her a look that felt like both a promise and a threat. James stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the Denver skyline. Emily lingered at the door, unsure if she should leave. "You're not alone," he said quietly, without turning. Her throat tightened. For the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. The fire had scorched more than paper. It had seared trust, left the company fragile, shaken to its core. Yet, in the wreckage, James Harrington refused to surrender. Late one night, Emily Carter sat in a dimly lit office with Sam Whitaker, one of Harrington Global's senior IT engineers. Sam was in his mid-40s, practical, with tired eyes and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His desk was cluttered with external drives, cables, and monitors glowing with lines of code. Emily had carried the charred contract with her, the forged document that bore her name. Sam studied it under the harsh light, his fingers drumming thoughtfully. "On paper. This is just ink," he said. "But every file leaves a fingerprint. The question is whether whoever planted this was careless enough to leave theirs behind." Emily leaned closer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart raced. This was her chance, maybe the only chance to prove she wasn't the traitor they wanted her to be. Sam slid the forged file into a scanner. The hum of the machine filled the silence, followed by the clicking of keys as Sam's fingers moved with practiced precision. On the screen, lines of metadata unfurled timestamps, device IDs, hidden signatures invisible to the naked eye. "Look here," Sam muttered, pointing. "This contract was created on a machine inside our network, not external. That narrows it down." Emily's chest tightened. "Someone here, someone close," Sam confirmed. He zoomed in, cross-referencing digital imprints against the company's internal systems. The glow of the monitor illuminated his face, the tension etched into every line. Minutes ticked by, the room heavy with anticipation. Finally, Sam leaned back, exhaling slowly. His finger tapped the screen. "There. That's the device ID. And it belongs to—" Emily's breath caught as the name appeared. Daniel Cross. Her stomach lurched. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. It wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't suspicion whispered in corridors. It was proof. Sam glanced at her, his voice steady but cautious. "You need to be careful with this. Cross is powerful, well-connected. He'll deny everything. But this is the thread that can unravel him." Emily stared at the screen, the evidence glowing like a flare in the darkness. Relief warred with dread inside her. She had the truth, but truths like this were dangerous. "Can you back it up?" she asked, her voice low. Sam nodded. "I'll make copies, secure drives, off-site storage. Even if he burns the building down again, this won't disappear." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they tightened the knot in her chest, because she knew what came next: confrontation. The following morning, Emily carried the knowledge like a live wire in her chest. She walked through the lobby, her steps steady, but inside, her pulse raced. Every whisper, every glance from colleagues felt heavier now. She wanted to scream the truth, to shout, "It's Daniel." But timing mattered. In the boardroom, Daniel Cross sat with his usual ease, navy suit perfectly pressed, smile practiced. He leaned back in his chair, exuding calm while the directors argued over damage control. His dark eyes flicked to Emily once, holding her gaze just long enough to send a chill down her spine. He didn't know yet, but he would. James Harrington, seated at the head of the table, looked strained, his jaw set as he listened to the debates. When his eyes met Emily's, she gave the faintest nod. He caught it, recognition flashing briefly across his face. The time was coming. That night, Emily sat at her small apartment table again, the silver pen lying across the charred contract. The weight of both pressed against her. She had proof now, undeniable and sharp. But proof was not the same as victory. She closed her eyes, the thought circling like a restless bird. If Daniel forged my name once, what else has he planned, and how far will he go? To silence me now that I know, her phone buzzed. Another unknown number, another message. Too close. Her hands trembled, but her resolve did not waver. She picked up the silver pen, gripping it tightly, the dent pressing into her palm. The mask had slipped. Daniel Cross was no longer just a shadow at the edge of the storm. He was the storm, and Emily Carter would not be swept away. The boardroom was tense enough to shatter. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Harrington Global's tower, catching the polished wood of the long table. But no one noticed the view. All eyes were fixed on the documents spread across the screens. Emily Carter sat near the center this time, not pushed to the shadows as before. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her spine was straight. Her pulse thundered in her ears as Sam Whitaker, the IT engineer, presented the findings. "Every digital file carries an imprint," Sam explained calmly, scrolling through metadata displayed on the projector. "This forged contract is no different. The embedded data tells us the exact machine that created it, the timestamp, even the internal user credentials." He tapped a line of code highlighted on the screen, and those credentials belonged to Daniel Cross. The words fell like a hammer. Silence rippled across the room. Directors exchanged startled glances. Richard Hale's face drained of color. Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Metadata can be faked," he said smoothly. "You expect this board to gamble on the word of a secretary and a tired technician." Sam's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "We anticipated that claim, which is why we cross-checked the metadata against server access logs." He clicked again, revealing another set of records. "Here is the exact login from Daniel's device, exporting documents the night of the fire." And here he tapped his security footage of his assistant carrying equipment toward the restricted corridor that evening. Gasps filled the room. Daniel's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed, sharp and cold, but his voice remained deceptively calm. "This is circumstantial. Ambitious secretaries and desperate CEOs will say anything to protect themselves." Richard Hale, usually quick with cutting remarks, shifted uncomfortably. "Daniel, Is this true? Daniel turned his gaze on him, the veneer of charm cracking. Don't tell me you're falling for this charade. Richard, you and I both know how these things work. But Richard's hands trembled slightly. For years, he had built his influence on Daniel's backing. Now the floor beneath him shifted. James Harrington finally rose, his chair scraping against the marble. His voice carried steel. This is no charade. This is sabotage. Daniel Cross forged documents to frame Emily Carter, orchestrated leaks to destabilize this company, and nearly burned us to the ground literally. His green eyes swept the table, and every shred of proof points to him. For the first time, Daniel's calm cracked. He stood abruptly, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won? Harrington. You think this little secretary can save you? I am Harrington Global's future. Without me, you'll collapse. Emily rose slowly, her palms flat against the table. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. You're wrong. All eyes turned to her. For weeks, you've tried to make me doubt myself. You forged my name, turned whispers into weapons, tried to bury me in shame. But here I stand. Her blue eyes met his, unwavering. You thought I was a pawn. You forgot pawns can reach the other side of the board. A murmur swept the room. Richard swallowed hard, his face pale. He looked from Daniel to Emily, then back to James. For once, his bluster failed him. The chairwoman, silent until now, finally spoke. Her tone was clipped, firm. The evidence is clear. Daniel Cross, you are suspended from all duties effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The matter will be turned over to federal investigators. Daniel's eyes burned as he glanced around the table. His smile was gone, replaced by something colder, rawer. Finally, his gaze lingered on Emily. This isn't the end, he hissed, but the guards were already at his shoulders. He straightened his coat, forced a thin smile, and walked out. His footsteps echoed like a drumbeat of defeat. The room exhaled. Richard Hale sank into his chair, his hands trembling. His power had been tethered to Daniel's, and now both were crumbling. He muttered something under his breath, but no one was listening. All attention shifted to Emily. For the first time since this nightmare began, the eyes fixed on her were not suspicious, not condemning. They were steady, respectful. James spoke quietly, but his words filled the room. Miss Carter stood against fear when no one else did. She endured attacks meant to break her, and she refused to bend. Harrington Global owes her more than we can ever repay. Emily's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze briefly, struggling to keep her composure. For so long, she had been invisible, dismissed as just a secretary. Now, she was seen not as a liability, but as a woman of strength, of courage. Her fingers brushed the silver pen in her bag, the dent pressing into her palm like an anchor. For the first time, she believed it herself. She wasn't just surviving, she was standing. And the storm that had nearly consumed her was finally breaking apart. The building was quieter that evening than it had been in weeks. The chaos of the fire, the shouting in the boardroom, the venom of whispered rumors, all of it seemed to have drained from Harrington Global's walls. The storm had passed, at least for now. Emily Carter wandered into the staff lounge just after 7. The space was nearly deserted, the hum of the vending machines the only sound. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above mismatched tables and chairs, a far cry from the polished marble of the executive floor. But there, on the counter, was a small surprise: 2 thermoses of soup and a paper bag with warm bread tucked inside. A handwritten note leaned against it. Thought you might need this. Maya. Emily smiled faintly, her chest softening at the thought of her friend's quiet kindness. She set the bread on the table and unscrewed the thermos lid, letting the scent of chicken and herbs drift into the air. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned to find James Harrington at the doorway, his tie gone, his sleeves rolled up. For once, he looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man at the end of a long day. Dinner, he said simply, nodding toward the food. Emily arched a brow. Soup in the lounge? Very glamorous? His lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen all day. Victory doesn't always come with champagne. He crossed the room and sat across from her, reaching for one of the thermoses. The two of them poured the soup into paper cups, steam curling into the air. Emily broke the bread, sliding half across the table. For a while, they ate in silence. The warmth of the broth steadied her, grounding her in a way no fine meal ever could. Around them, the lounge was ordinary, unremarkable, but that ordinariness was its comfort. Finally, James spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "You saved us today." Emily shook her head. "I saved myself. The rest just happened along the way." His green eyes held hers steadily. "No, you stood in front of me that first day. You've stood beside me every day since. Don't diminish that." Her throat tightened. She looked down at her soup, unable to hold his gaze for long. For weeks, she had carried fear, doubt, shame. Now, hearing his words, something within her loosened just a little. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. James reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and silver. He set it on the table between them. Emily's breath caught. The fountain pen. The same one she had borrowed weeks ago. The same one that had seemed to follow her through every storm. James's hand lingered on it before he let go. His voice was low, almost rough. "This belonged to my father. He gave it to me when I became CEO. He said it was a reminder that signatures carry weight, that every stroke of ink can change lives." Emily stared at the pen, the metal gleaming faintly in the harsh light. "And do you still believe that?" she asked softly. James's gaze darkened, thoughtful. "I want to, but lately, I wonder if all I've signed away is my soul." Her chest ached at the quiet vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to tell him he hadn't lost himself completely, that she had seen the man beneath the armor, the one who still carried dignity and care, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, James pushed the pen gently toward her. "It belongs with someone who understands loyalty." Emily blinked, startled. "James, I can't—" "Yes, you can," he interrupted, his voice firm but warm. "Because it's not about contracts. It's about courage. And you've shown more of that than anyone I've ever known." Her fingers hesitated before wrapping around the pen. The metal was cool against her skin, the dent pressing familiar against her palm. But this time, it felt different. Not borrowed, not temporary. Given, trusted. Her eyes lifted to his. "Why me?" For once, James didn't deflect. He leaned forward, his gaze steady, unguarded. "Because you stood in front of me when the whole world ran. And because I can't imagine standing without you anymore." Emily's breath caught, her chest trembling with emotions she had long buried under fear and duty. She looked down at the silver pen in her hands, then back at him. "I didn't protect you out of obligation," she whispered. "I did it because I couldn't bear to see you fall." The air between them shifted. No more masks, no more pretense, just truth. They sat there for a long time, the soup cooling, the bread half-eaten, the silver pen glinting faintly between them. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't champagne. But in that quiet lounge, over soup and bread, victory had never tasted so real. The city was quiet that night. From the upper floors of Harrington Global, the lights stretched endlessly across Denver, glittering like 1,000 scattered stars. Inside James Harrington's office, the blinds were half drawn, soft golden light spilling across polished wood and the faint trace of smoke that still lingered after the fire. Emily Carter stood near the window, the silver pen resting in her palm. She turned it slowly, the dent catching the lamplight, her thoughts a restless tide. Behind her, James leaned against his desk, jacket gone, tie loosened. For once, the unshakable CEO looked human, tired, worn, but alive. His eyes never left her. "You haven't put it down," he said quietly. Emily looked at the pen, then at him. "It feels heavier than it should." "That's because it carries more than ink," James replied, his voice low. It carries trust. Silence stretched between them, warm but unspoken. Emily felt her chest tighten. She had stood through weeks of suspicion, whispers, even threats. But this moment frightened her more than all of it. James broke the silence first. He straightened, his hands sliding into his pockets as though anchoring himself. His green eyes softened, his words careful but steady. "I meant what I said in the boardroom. I can't imagine standing without you anymore." Her breath caught. The words were simple, but they reached a place she had kept hidden, a place no one had touched in years. Emily turned back to the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "Do you know why I stood in front of you that day?" James's voice was quiet. "Because you're braver than anyone I've ever known." She shook her head gently. "No, it wasn't bravery. It wasn't duty. Either." She turned, her blue eyes meeting his. Steady now. "It was my heart." The words hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to be vulnerable, not the steady secretary, not the quiet survivor, but the woman who had carried unspoken feelings since the moment she saw him falter in that hallway. James took a slow step closer, then another. His presence filled the space between them, grounding, undeniable. "I've spent years hiding behind titles," he said, his voice raw. "The CEO, the strategist, the man who signs papers and commands rooms. But you," his throat tightened, "you've seen past all of it. You've seen me when I was weak, when I was angry, when I had nothing left to give. And still, you stayed." Emily's chest trembled. She wanted to look away, but his gaze held her fast. "I didn't stay because of your title, James. I stayed because I saw the man beneath it, and I couldn't bear to see him fall." The air shifted, heavy with truth. For weeks, they had danced around it through glances, through silences, through battles fought side by side. Now, at last, there was no mask, no armor. James lifted a hand, hesitating as though afraid to cross a line. Emily didn't move. Slowly, his hand came to rest over hers, closing gently around the silver pen she still held. Her fingers trembled beneath his touch, but she didn't let go. Their eyes locked, and for a long moment, nothing else existed. Not the board, not the company, not the shadows still circling them. Just two people stripped bare of everything but the truth. "Emily," James said softly, her name almost a vow. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." The words broke something open inside him. His hand tightened slightly, and for the first time, James Harrington let the fortress of silence crumble. He leaned closer, not rushed, not demanding, just present, steady, as though every inch was a choice. Emily felt her heart race, but she didn't step back. When his forehead rested gently against hers, she closed her eyes, the weight of the world finally slipping away. No more masks, no more distance. For the first time, they allowed themselves to be simply human. Two souls who had carried storms, now finding shelter in each other. They stayed that way for a long while, speaking little, letting the silence carry what words could not. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, a reminder that the world outside still spun, still whispered, still watched. But in this room, there was only truth. When at last Emily pulled back, her cheeks were damp, though she hadn't realized she'd been crying. James brushed a tear away with the gentlest touch, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Emily nodded, her hand still clasping his, the silver pen pressed between them like a promise. Together. And for the first time since the storm began, she believed the word completely. Weeks passed, and the chaos that once rattled Harrington Global slowly began to settle. The smoke from the fire had long since cleared, but its scars lingered in the charred walls of the server room and in the wary glances exchanged in corridors. Yet, step by step, the company was rebuilding not only its systems, but its spirit. The board, shaken by Daniel Cross's exposure, shifted course. Richard Hale, his influence shattered, resigned quietly under mounting pressure. In his place, new leaders emerged, younger voices eager to steer the company with integrity rather than fear. The tower felt different now, lighter, though the shadows of the past still lingered at its edges. For Emily Carter, the transformation was even more profound. She was no longer just the secretary, no longer the woman whispered about in hallways, judged by viral clips or forged contracts. Now, when she walked through the lobby, employees nodded respectfully, some smiled, a few even paused to thank her outright. She wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention, but she had learned to walk with her head high, to let dignity be her shield. One afternoon, Maya appeared at her desk with 2 mugs of cocoa. "You're practically a legend now, you know," she teased, setting the cup down. "Half the staff call you our shield, the other half, our compass." Emily chuckled softly, though her cheeks warmed. "I'm neither. I just did what I had to do." "Sometimes," Maya said, sipping her cocoa. "That's all it takes to change everything." Justice was not forgotten. The 4 men who had stormed into the office that fateful day were not simply cast aside. Instead, James Harrington insisted on meeting with them directly, with Emily by his side, in a quiet mediation room, stripped of the grandeur of boardrooms. The men sat across from him, faces lined with exhaustion, bitterness, and regret. They spoke of broken pensions, contracts ignored, families left in limbo. They were not villains. They were victims of a system that had failed to listen. For the first time, James did not meet anger with defense. He listened. Emily, seated beside him, reminded him gently when words turned sharp. And in the end, agreements were reached, not settlements swept under the rug, but solutions rooted in fairness. 2 men accepted new roles within the company, given a second chance at dignity. The others received restitution long overdue. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. And for Emily, it was proof that courage had not been in vain. One evening, long after most had gone home, James and Emily sat together in the staff lounge once more. The space had become their quiet refuge, far from the noise of power and expectation. Tonight, there was no soup, no bread, only the simple silence of 2 people who no longer needed masks. On the table between them lay the silver fountain pen, its dented barrel gleaming faintly under the soft light. James reached for it, then paused. His gaze lingered on Emily, thoughtful. "My father once told me legacy is measured not in what you build, but in what you choose to protect." Emily touched the pen gently, her fingers brushing against his. "And what do you choose to protect?" Now his answer was simple: truth, loyalty, and you. Her chest tightened, but she didn't look away. Instead, she closed her hand around the pen, its weight familiar, no longer a burden, but a bond. For the first time in her life, Emily Carter felt not invisible, not secondary, but whole. The months that followed brought renewal. Harrington Global, once teetering on collapse, found new footing. Investors returned, not because of numbers alone, but because of the story of a secretary who stood before chaos, of a CEO who chose truth over reputation, of a company that rose from fire stronger than before. And Emily. She became more than a figure at the edge of the story. She became its heartbeat. Departments sought her counsel. Employees trusted her instinct. To some, she was still the secretary. But to many, she was something greater. A reminder that courage, once lit, could spread like wildfire. On a quiet Friday evening, as the city lights blinked awake beyond the tower's windows, Emily lingered at her desk. Her hand rested on the silver pen, the cool metal steady beneath her fingers. She thought of the journey, the shouts in the boardroom, the smoke of the fire, the threats that had haunted her nights. She thought of James, of Maya, of every choice that had led her here. Her reflection in the glass seemed different now, stronger, calmer, a woman who had risked everything to stand for truth and had not been broken. As the clock ticked, she whispered softly to herself, a question that had followed her since the very beginning. If standing for truth meant risking your reputation, would you dare to step forward? She didn't know how others might answer, but she knew her own, and she knew she would choose it again. Life rarely tests us when we feel ready. More often, it strikes in moments of ordinary routine, a quiet office, a familiar hallway, a simple day that suddenly turns into a storm. Emily Carter's story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand firm when running would be easier. We all face times when we are underestimated, when the world sees only our title, our age, or our position. Yet dignity is not about power, it's about integrity. Emily did not protect James Harrington because of obligation, but because she refused to betray her own values. And in the end, it was that quiet, steady strength that turned whispers of doubt into respect. For those of us who have lived long enough to know life's uncertainties, this lesson rings especially true. Standing for truth may cost us comfort, even reputation, but it restores something greater, our humanity. So, when the next storm comes, ask yourself, will you run with the crowd, or will you dare to take one step forward? Sometimes, one small act of courage can change everything, not only for others, but for ourselves. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to this story. If it touched your heart or made you think, we'd be grateful if you could give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you stories of courage, truth, and love. Until next time, take care and keep shining.